Hello, BookTube and Repairman Jack fans. I am talking about Legacies. This is book 2 in F. Paul Wilson's Repairman Jack series. So, the first book, which I already reviewed, is The Tomb, which is also part of the Adversary Cycle. And then Legacies is book number 2, and then book number 3, which I will be reading next, and I'll have videos on that very soon, is Conspiracies. So, I've already posted the spoiler-free review of this video, and in case you are new to the channel and you're just starting with this video, I am reading every single Repairman Jack book in order. It's going to be one book a week, and I'm posting 2 videos, a spoiler-free video, and then a longer discussion video. So this is the discussion video. I'm going to get into the content of this book, so if you have not read it, and you don't want it to be spoiled, then you probably shouldn't watch this. But if you don't care about spoilers, or if you've read it before, then enjoy. So, I don't know if you're aware of the history with Legacies. Now, I don't know very much, and what I mean by the history is I'm talking about the publication history and what F. Paul Wilson did when it came to publishing the book. If you've watched interviews with him, though, and you've heard him talk about Repairman Jack, then this is no big secret that I'm revealing here. Basically, he wrote The Tomb in 1984. He knew that Jack could very well be a series character, but he did not want to have his entire writing career be devoted to an ongoing series. So the way he left off The Tomb is you've got Jack, who is basically bleeding out on the couch in his apartment, at least in the revised edition. I'm not sure if in the original edition that's the exact same ending, but in any case, he leaves it unclear whether Jack is going to be okay or not. And then he doesn't come back to the character aside from some short fiction that he published along the way. He didn't come back to it until he got to Legacies. And this is, and I'm not trying to co-opt his story here, but in case you have not watched an interview where he goes over this, I'll give you the quick rundown. Basically, he was in a 3-book contract with a publisher. I'm not sure if it was like Tor Macmillan or if it was a different publisher, but in any case, he was part of the contract, or the contract itself, stipulated that he had to write 3 medical thrillers, and he had already written 2 at this point, and he was kind of growing tired of the genre at that point in his career, and he wanted to do something different. And so he figured, well, if I come back to Jack, and one of his clients is in the medical field, then maybe they will accept it as my 3rd book as a medical thriller. And he has said that, the publisher was not fooled by this, to use his words, but they were fine with it because bringing back Jack very likely meant that the book was going to sell well. And so that was in 1998 when he published this, and then Conspiracies came out in 2000, I believe, and then it really has been a Repairman Jack book every single year since then, up until 2014 or something like that. Where there's been a brief hiatus, and I say brief when you consider that it was like 15 years or something like that of just consecutive annual Jack books that are coming out, but he's now got another one coming out this fall, which is The Last Christmas. And that's a fun little connection with Legacies, because Legacies takes place during Christmas. I've said it before in my announcement video that in The Last Christmas, if Jack does not impale somebody with a Christmas tree, I am going to be sorely disappointed. And you do get that. You don't get him impaling somebody with a Christmas tree in this, but you do get Jack as Santa Claus, who just beats the hell out of this guy who steals the toys from the aid center where Alicia Clayton is working. And that is such a fun element to this story. If I mentioned it in the spoiler-free video that I did for Legacies, that if you just read the first 50 pages of this up until the end of that whole section of the book, I think it'd be a really satisfying, long, short story of who is Jack, how does he go about solving these problems, what kind of situations is he looking to fix, and it is just the quintessential Jack solution to all of that, or at least the Jack kind of situation that he would want to fix. And so you get that fun little scene there where he then dresses up as Santa Claus, and then he brutally beats this man who has stolen the toys. And so you get to see Jack's darkness come out there. And I think that's really what I'll do to begin the discussion in terms of like the content you get to see how brutal Jack can be when he is dispensing righteous violence, when he feels that somebody has fully deserved a violent end to what they have done. Not that he necessarily is going to kill the person, but that the darkness in Jack takes over. And that is a big theme that comes up in the series. It does come up in the Tomb, but I think you get to see it unleashed a fair bit more here. And so this is page 50 to 51. I just want to read parts of this just to kind of get a sense of it. The guy who has stolen the toys, his name is the Nail. The Nail felt the gun ripped from his hand, heard it skitter across the asphalt. After that, things got fuzzy and painful. The Nail remembered getting flipped over onto his belly, grabbed by his collar and his waistband, and hauled off the ground. I checked my list, Santa said. Checked it twice, in fact. It says you've been naughty, Sonny. Very naughty. Then Santa started using him like a battering ram. Slam, head first against the bumper of the truck. Know what happens when you steal from Santa Claus? This. Slam. Head first into a bunch of trash cans lining the alley. If I decide to let you live, spread the word. Don't mess with Santa Claus. The Nail was spun around and flung face first against one of the alley's brick walls. He let out a puny groan of agony as he slid down the wall, feeling like a splattered egg oozing toward the ground. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Nail felt his consciousness fading over the next 10 minutes, as Santa used him like some sort of rag to wipe up the alley. Finally, Santa released him. The Nail dropped to the ground, a puddle of agony on the broken pavement. He felt his breath bubbling through his bloody mouth. He was sure his jaw was broken, and his ribs. Every breath was a dozen stab wounds. Was it over? He hoped so. He prayed it was over. Okay, and then it continues on beyond this. That Jack then humiliates the guy by lashing him to the front of the truck and driving him, recklessly through town until he gets in front of the center where this criminal has stolen the toys. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is, like I say, you get to see Jack's violence and the darkness in him that comes out in this. And it is a big theme in the Repairman Jack books. And I think that this is what makes Wilson's writing really interesting, and in part what makes the Repairman Jack books so interesting, is that you have these blends of genres, which I talked about in the Tomb, and you definitely are getting different genres getting blended here. And I've mentioned it before, but you've got elements of horror in this. And I think that you get to see that Wilson does write horror, and that there is a horror element to these books. And what I mean by that is, more so than what you would get in an ordinary action novel. Like, let's say, Lee Child's books with Jack Reacher. There's definitely violence in there, but there's not the brutal violence that you get in the Jack books, and where you are cheering for Jack. Wilson does a great job of setting up these really despicable people who have got either no morality or just such messed up ethics that you want to see them get hurt. And if you're the type of reader who doesn't enjoy that, you won't like these books. But if you are the kind of reader who wants to see justice get done, and you feel like the justice system has got flaws, then you can kind of vicariously enjoy these stories, knowing that it's fiction, that it's pure imagination, but being able to, at least through this act of fiction, be able to say, to find a satisfying solution to some of the awful stuff that happens in the world. To say, that's so great to see a person who does something like that actually get their due. And wouldn't it be so satisfying to have solutions like that? And that's where the books are acting as vigilante fiction. And vigilante fiction is incredibly popular, and you have to do a fairly good job of setting up the righteousness of your protagonist, that they are doing these violent actions for a good reason. So a great example of that would be like a good recent example would be the John Wick films, where you see what they do to his dog, and you're just like, oh no, you don't get to do that and get away with it. And then you're actively cheering for John Wick as a character. And you get that in Legacies. You're like, you literally stole from children who have nothing, who have got AIDS, where they don't have parents. They often are dealing with substance abuse addictions because of the mother who is continuing to use when she was pregnant. And that the guy who does this, the nail, then he's even got a kid in the center, and he literally is just stealing toys from his own child. It's despicable. And so when Jack does this thing, you're like, good. All right. And like I say, that might make some readers uncomfortable. And if so, you are probably not going to enjoy any Repairman Jack book, and certainly not going forward, because there is more violence like this that comes up in the series. So you get to see that. And then you get to see Gia's attitude towards the repair business. And, she really doesn't like what Jack does. And this is, of course, a leitmotif of the series, as in it's a recurring theme that just comes up again and again. And so you do see that in the tomb, but they're not really a couple in the tomb. They're on a break, essentially. And she explains why she thinks Jack does what he does, where she says, that she says, admit it, you do get emotionally involved. He says, I try not to, it's dangerous. That's my point. You identify with everybody you take on as a client. Customer, please. Lawyers and accountants have clients. I have customers. All right, customers. My point is you don't hire out to just anyone who happens to have the necessary cash. I go case by case. Jack was growing uncomfortable. He wanted off the subject. I mean, I've got to feel I can do the job, otherwise we're both wasting time. I'm just a small businessman, Gia. She groaned and flopped onto her back. A small businessman who has no social security number, dozens of last names, and never pay taxes. I pay sales tax, sometimes. Face it, Jack, this Repairman Jack stuff gives you a rush, and you're hooked on it. And I'm skipping over the next paragraph here. It's just a description where he says, maybe I am and maybe I'm not, but let's just say I retire, hang up the Repairman Jack suit, as you so eloquently put it. What then? And then you kind of get into this whole thing where she pushes for them to get married, and he starts thinking about the idea of having an ordinary life. But there's several things that I want to point out there. One of them is this idea that Jack identifies with his clients that he takes on. And you absolutely see that with Alicia Clayton in a really interesting way later on in the book. But the other thing too, and so before I get to that part, the other thing is the idea of Jack giving up what he's doing and just doing something different. Now, this is something that I did not catch at all when I first read these books, but I actually think that it's a theme that Wilson is either consciously or unconsciously exploring. And that theme is Jack can be representative of a whole group of people, but especially middle-aged men without very much education in terms of formal education, whose jobs are in danger of either being outsourced or lost to automation. That he has got something that he's good at that a lot of people maybe they don't see a lot of value in, or they think, well, even if there's value there, why do you have to do this? That work can be done by someone else, by the justice system, or whatever else in Jack's case. Jack doesn't want to move on. He doesn't want to retrain. He doesn't want to try doing something else. He likes what he does for a living, and he knows that he has got value, even if society doesn't necessarily place a high value on it, and he doesn't want to switch out of this, and he feels that he shouldn't be forced to switch out of this. If he's going to do it on his own terms, and he's not going to do it because through coercion from Gia, or certainly not from the government, from the justice system saying, no, we'll take over from here, you don't need to do this. He wants to be in charge of his own life, and this job gives him the freedom to do that. And I think that for so many people who either have lost a job where they were working, in, let's say, manufacturing, and they've lost their job. And then the idea of, well, go and learn to code, go and become a computer programmer. And it's like, well, I had that job for a reason, because I don't want to work in an office. So the idea that you're then going to take me and put me in an office is a pretty repulsive thought. Like, it's actually upsetting for millions and millions of workers. And I think that Jack, he can be read as somebody who's experiencing this. It's, hey, why don't you go do something respectable? And he's like, I don't want to do what you want me to do. I like what I'm doing. And I know that it might seem unorthodox or uncouth in some ways, where it's not civilized, you know, but it is. It's something that is necessary, and it is important, and it gives him a sense of purpose, and he gets to be his own boss. And the idea of having to follow someone else's rules, especially arbitrary rules that you would see in an office workplace, just has not only no interest for Jack, but it's a terrifying idea. So that's an interesting thing. I'm going to see how that comes up in the rest of the books, but I did really notice that when I was reading through it. So you get that. You also have got this really funny scene with Abe Grossman in the weapons shop, where he's in his sports shop, in the Isher sports shop. But he's got this customer who comes in. This is like page 24 to 25, and the guy's looking for fishing hooks, right? And Abe won't sell it to him because he doesn't carry them. So then Abe says, "Hooks?" Abe was saying. "Why should you want hooks? Can you imagine how that must hurt a fish when it bites into it? And those barbs, oi! You've got to rip them out. Such damage to the tender mouth tissues. Stick a fish hook in your own tongue sometime and see how you like it." And the customer cannot believe this. He says, why? I thought that this is a sports shop. Abe continues on, and he explains what his real issue is. He says, "It's an ethical position. Baiting a hook or using those flashing little spinners to catch a fish, it's deceitful. Think about it. You're dressing up a nasty little hook to look like food, like sustenance. A fish comes along, thinks it's found lunch, and wham, it's hooked and pulled out of the water. Is that fair? You're proud of such a thing?" He straightened and fixed the guy with his dark brown eyes. "I should be a party to a so-called sport based on treachery and deceit? No, I cannot." "You're serious?" the guy said, backing away. "You're really serious?" "I should be a comedian," Abe said. "This place looks like the Improv to you, maybe?" "No, I sell sporting goods." "Sporting! That means something to me. A net is sporting. You wait for the fish to come along, and then you scoop it up with a net. The fastest one wins. That's a sport. A net, I'll sell you. But hooks? You'll get no hooks from me." Well, on the one hand, it's a funny scene. It's a very funny scene, when, especially the first time you read it, or if you haven't read it in a while, that I couldn't help but notice, just how funny it is, and then hearing it in the accent that Abe would be saying this in. But I think that this is very obviously representative. Abe is having a whole other conversation here. You know that he won't sell weapons to certain people who come in who are looking to do something that he thinks is unethical. That it's not that he is looking to the state government or the federal government or any of that, the justice system writ large. He's not looking to them to give him his own sense of ethics and what is fair, what should be legal and what should be illegal when it comes to weapons. He doesn't care about that, but he does have ethics. He's got a very clear set of principles of who he will sell to and who he won't sell to, of what kinds of weapons he'll sell and which kinds he won't. And so you get that fun little scene there where you're having this, you as the reader are getting this dramatic irony where you're realizing that Abe is having actually a very different conversation. Although, yes, he is talking about fish hooks, and he might really feel that way about fishing, but he feels this way about what he does when it comes to selling weapons. So I wanted to point that out because I think that's an interesting part of the book. You get, I think, a really interesting part here where you get to see Jack's decoy cabin, which is so fun, where it's rigged and there's booby traps all over, and the way he lulls them into this false sense of security. Then he has like fake bombs in order to get them to go out to the rusted old pickup truck, which then explodes. Then he's got the tunnel in there to get to the other side of the road, and there's just so much of that where I'm saying you see Jack in the tomb, and he is capable, but he seems much more capable by Legacies. He seems just better prepared to take on people like this, who are coming after him. And I'm not saying that he wasn't like that in the tomb. It's just we don't see that in the tomb, in part because he's dealing with supernatural creatures. And that's the interesting thing to me about Legacies, is that this is very much just a pretty much it's a purely it's a pure crime thriller, like what you get in Jack the early years, where there's no supernatural elements. There's really nothing that connects with, at least not overtly, with the secret history of the world, or this cosmic battle going on between these two big forces. And Jack is really just a tiny, tiny little piece in this entire game, that really you don't have any of that stuff going on here. And I will address it because I think there are some connections. But you get to see Jack, who is in his element. He is at the top of his game. And you also get to see him improving, because you get the really fun scene where he learns how to hack a building. He learns this from his friend Milk Dud. And that whole thing is so much fun, which then comes up again later on in the series, where Jack, even though he does not like the experience, he becomes better at his job because of this. So you're seeing him not only doing all these fun, cool action things, but you also see him getting better. You see the cabin, but now you see that he's learning a new skill as he goes. So I think that's a fun element to the book. Okay, in terms of the secret history of the world, like I say, you don't really have this whole big cosmic horror thing hanging over this book, but you do have broadcast power, right? That's really the technology that's going on in this book. That you've got the people from the Middle East with Kamel, who's representing them. And then you've got the Japanese with Yoshio, who's there, who's trying to find out what's going on. But basically, you've got these Middle Eastern countries that don't want broadcast power, which ends up being solar powered, and then you can broadcast it using these aerial devices, by just having a little a little antenna on any appliance or electrical device. That the Middle Eastern countries obviously don't want this to get out, because it would be the collapse of their economy, because they're so dependent on the sale of oil. And then a country like Japan would, of course, hugely benefit, because they really have no oil reserves, so they're entirely dependent on importing all of that. And so you get really, I don't know if the name comes up in this at all, but it's Nikolai Tesla's technology of broadcast power that he was experimenting with in the early part of the 20th century. Now, I don't know a whole bunch about this, but I do know that he was experimenting with this. I know that Tesla comes up again in the Repairman Jack books. I also know that I have not read it yet, but Wilson's novella Wardenclyffe, which absolutely has to do with Nikolai Tesla, broadcast power, and all of this, the secret history of the world, that gets explored in the novella, which he released, I think, last year in 2018. So even though on the surface Legacies doesn't have to do with the secret history of the world, he ultimately brings it into the secret history of the world through Wardenclyffe, as best I understand. I will eventually get around to that, and I very likely will post a video on it, but I've obviously got a lot of books between now and Wardenclyffe. So that's almost everything that I wanted to mention. But the other thing, too, that I think is really interesting is when, this is going back to what I said earlier, where Gia says to Jack, you identify with everybody you take on as a client, and then you get to see that in Legacies. And so Jack really, it might not seem overt, and I don't know how self-aware he is about this aspect of it, But here's what happens. You've got Alicia Clayton, Dr. Alicia Clayton, who is the client. She, has got her brother coming after her, who wants to buy this house that her father left to her in his will. And she doesn't want the house. She doesn't want to sell it to her brother, and so you get that whole tension throughout the book. And then you find out why she has such issues both with her brother and with her deceased father. And you find out that her father had been orchestrating the sexual abuse, like getting her brother to do this to her and then taking photographs of it. And it's like awful. It's horrendous. This actually, like, child abuse that gets photographed. And I'm trying to use the language that Jack uses, that he won't use the cutesy language that you get for this. That it comes up again in the series. I forget exactly which book it comes up in, but this is not the only time that Jack comes across somebody who has been doing this. And you see how this has, like, this is childhood trauma for her, where she can't even bring herself to go into the house. Eventually she does, but she can't even go down into the basement when she does end up in the house. That it's childhood trauma for her, which really makes her who she is, that she's never had a healthy relationship, that it's what drives her to, be devoted to studying and books and spending time in libraries, which is what gets her into med school, which puts her on the West Coast, and then eventually she comes back to New York. But this trauma that she experiences as a child hangs over her for her entire life, and it's really only by the end of this, where she's able to destroy the photographs, her father's dead, her brother is now dead, that she is able to move on. And you see that by the end of the book that she is able to move on from this childhood trauma. Now, Jack also experiences childhood trauma. It doesn't really come up in anything other than a fairly general reference to something that happened to his mother, but you do get the whole history of that in The Tomb, where Jack's mother was killed, and then that's why he becomes Repairman Jack. And it's because of that childhood trauma. Now, Jack was much older at the time. I think he was 17, and Alicia was, younger than 10 when this was going on. But to me, the interesting part is that Jack also experiences childhood trauma, and it's what makes him into Repairman Jack. And so then seeing that Alicia is responding in a very different way than Jack to the trauma that she's experienced as a child, she also is incredibly impacted by this. And then you do have the one scene where she catches that one guy at the center who is sexually abusing the girl in the closet, and then she turns into Jack. She becomes brutally violent in attacking this guy. So you get to see the connections there. But the other part of that too is that you can see why Jack, aside from just this childhood trauma, that he could identify with that aspect of Alicia, you've also got the terror for him, which is what happens to her is that because of what her father was doing and because of the internet, then you get the photographs that end up online, and that her brother says, that we're stars online, we're famous within that despicable sub community. And so you realize that that's really Jack's greatest fear. And what I mean by his maybe not his greatest fear, but it's a big fear of his, which is the internet and the system in general. Once it pulls you in, it has this aspect of permanence, that you can't delete something from the internet. That she can burn or burn the photographs, she can shred them, but ultimately there's all this stuff that's online that you're never going to be able to get rid of. And that's basically Jack's fear. Once you get pulled into the system, once you have a social security number, once you start having official identity, once you register with the IRS, you're in. You can never get out. So you're always going to be monitored in some way. And when you're monitored, that means that people are invading your privacy and they're telling you what is acceptable and unacceptable work, what is legal and what is illegal. And he doesn't want somebody else to dictate to him what he's allowed to do and what he's not allowed to do. He wants to set his own ethics, and he doesn't want a legislator in Congress telling him what is an acceptable way of earning money. He wants to decide that for himself, which jobs he takes and which ones he won't take. So this idea, though, that like what happens to Alicia, she can't escape it because the photographs are out there and they're permanent, and that is a terrifying concept for Jack. So I think that's the connection that he's ultimately making with her, although it doesn't come up very overtly within the book. So those are all the things that I have to say. There's plenty more that I'm sure I could get into, and you can feel free to comment below stuff that you noticed about the book, or jumping off of any ideas that I mentioned. But it's a really interesting one, especially coming off of The Tomb. And as a standalone Jack book, I think it's fun, and it's got a really fun structure. Like I say, if you, and this is something to consider if you're trying to get somebody into the Repairman Jack books, then you can start with The Tomb and get them to read that. But it's a full-length book, 400 plus pages, and so somebody might not really be sure if they want to even commit to that. Get them to read the first 50 pages or so of Legacies, where Jack gets those toys back for the children from the medical center. And they can decide pretty well from there, do I like this character or not? Do I want to follow him along this big journey through all of these books or not? And I think that's maybe a good place to start with the series for somebody who has not done so before. All right. I hope you enjoyed this, and like I say, feel free to comment below any thoughts that you have on it. Thanks so much. Bye.